Margaret Holloway hurled the bowl of stew straight at the wall. It shattered. Hot broth ran down the wooden planks like a wound. "Say it again," she said. Her voice was dead quiet. "I dare you to say it again to my face." Elias Carter stood in the kitchen doorway with 12 men behind him, and not one of them moved. Because the woman they had spent 30 days calling too soft, too fat, too useless to this land, was standing in the middle of their kitchen with a cast-iron ladle in her hand and absolutely nothing left to lose. If you've ever been told you were too much or not enough, stay with me until the very end. Hit subscribe and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels, because what happened next at Broken Willow Ranch changed everything. The stagecoach pulled into Broken Willow at noon on a Tuesday in late April, and by the time the dust settled, every man on the property had already decided what kind of woman was going to step out of it. They were wrong. Elias Carter stood at the edge of the yard with his arms crossed and his jaw set, the way he stood when he expected trouble and intended to meet it head-on. 22 years as foreman of this ranch had given him an instinct for problems, and the fact that Caleb Whitmore had sent off to some agency back east for a mail-order bride had been sitting wrong with him for 3 months. Not because he had anything against marriage particularly, but because Caleb Whitmore was not a man who needed softness in his life. He needed someone who could handle this land, this crew, and the particular kind of silence that Caleb carried around with him like a second coat. Elias had never met a woman who fit that description, and he doubted very much that one was about to step out of that coach. He was right about that part at least. The door swung open. The woman who descended the steps was nothing like what any of them had pictured. She was not tall, she was not angular or sun-hardened in the way frontier women became after years of surviving out here. She was full-figured, round-faced, with a large soft body that her worn brown dress did nothing to minimize. And she moved with the careful deliberateness of someone who was used to taking up space in a world that had spent a long time making clear she wasn't supposed to. She carried one small suitcase. She wore no hat. Her dark hair was pinned back simply, and her eyes when she looked out across the yard were quiet and watchful and took in everything at once. Thomas Reed, 19 years old and the newest hand on the property, leaned sideways toward Pete Calloway and said under his breath, "That's her?" Pete said nothing. He pressed his lips together and looked at the ground. Hank Dooley, who had a long history of saying the thing everyone else was only thinking, said it. Good Lord. Caleb sent for a wife and got himself. Hank Elias didn't raise his voice. He never had to. 2 decades of authority had given his voice a particular quality that cut through noise without increasing its volume. Hank's mouth closed, but the look that passed between him and the man to his left said everything the words hadn't. Margaret Holloway, because that was her name, though not a soul had used it yet, reached the bottom step, set her suitcase in the dirt, and looked at the ranch. At the house, at the barn, at the 12 men who were all working very hard to look like they weren't looking at her. Then she picked her suitcase back up and walked toward the front porch like she had somewhere important to be. Caleb Whitmore was waiting at the top of the steps. He was 41 years old and looked like a man who had been handsome once and had become something harder and more complicated with time, broad-shouldered, dark-haired, going gray at the temples, with a kind of face that had been weathered by equal parts sun and sorrow. He held himself with the practiced stillness of someone who had learned through long experience that wanting things too openly was an invitation for them to be taken away. He had been married once before. He did not talk about it. He had run this ranch alone for 7 years and had arrived somewhere in the middle of that 7th year at the conclusion that he needed help he was not willing to admit he needed, and that the most efficient solution was a practical arrangement with a woman who understood what she was agreeing to. He looked at Margaret. Margaret looked at him. The moment stretched slightly past comfortable. "Miss Holloway," he said. "Mr. Whitmore," she said. Her voice was quieter than he expected, steadier than he expected. "You had a long journey." "I did." She met his eyes without flinching. I'm not fragile, though, if that's what you're working up to say carefully. Something moved across his expression, too fast to name, too deliberate to be accidental. I wasn't working up to anything, he said. Good, she said. Then we understand each other. He held the door. She walked through. Behind her, from somewhere in the yard, Hank Dooley said quietly to no one in particular, well, she's got a mouth anyway. Elias turned and looked at him for exactly 3 seconds. Get back to work, he said. The kitchen was the first room she found. She always found the kitchen first. It was a habit built over years of walking into unfamiliar houses and immediately locating the room that told you the truth about who lived there, whether they were people who ate to survive or people who understood that feeding someone was an act of intention. Broken Willow's kitchen told her the truth quickly. It was large, the iron stove was heavy and good, the work table was scarred from years of hard use. The shelves were stocked but disorganized, supplies shoved wherever they fit rather than arranged by logic or frequency of use. There was a single window facing east. The floor was clean enough. The ceiling had a crack running from the east wall to somewhere above the stove that someone had repaired badly and not looked at since. It was a kitchen where food was made, not where food was cared about. Margaret set her suitcase by the door and went to the pantry. Cornmeal, dried beans, salt, pork, flour, low lard nearly out. Sugar, half a sack. Potatoes that needed to be used within days before they turned. A jar of apple preserves on the back of the highest shelf, coated in dust, pushed to where things go when people forget them. Dried herbs, thyme, rosemary, something she had to smell to identify hanging from a hook by the window. A pot that could feed 20. A cast-iron skillet seasoned by years of use into something close to perfect. She was still taking inventory when Caleb appeared in the doorway. I can show you the rest of the house, he said, in a bit. She didn't turn around. When does the crew eat supper? A pause, 6 o'clock. What have they been eating? Salt pork. Biscuits. Whatever's fastest. She looked at the potatoes. At the beans. At the forgotten jar of apple preserves. All right, she said. You don't have to start tonight. You just traveled 3 days. Mr. Whitmore. She turned, looked at him, directly the way she had learned to look at people who were about to make a decision about her, before she'd had a chance to show them anything. I didn't come here to rest. I came here to be useful. Unless you'd rather I sit in the parlor and wait for someone to find a use for me? He looked at her for a long moment. Then the aprons are on the hook by the back door. Thank you, she said, and turned back to the stove. Supper that first night was not remarkable. She wasn't trying for remarkable. She was trying to learn the room. Bean stew with salt pork and onion, thickened until it had some weight to it, seasoned past the point where it tasted like survival. Fresh biscuits, not the flat, airless kind that had apparently been the standard here, but the kind that pulled apart in layers. The apple preserves stewed down with a little water, and the last of the sugar, served warm, smelling like something from a different and better time. The men filed in at 6 with the silence of people who had stopped expecting anything. They passed the bowls with the mechanical efficiency of 12 men running on a schedule that had been the same so long it had stopped being a schedule and become simply the shape of the day. And then the first man took a bite. Nobody said anything. But Pete Calloway went still halfway through his first spoonful, the way a person goes still when something unexpected crosses their senses. He looked down at his bowl. He took another bite, slower this time. Thomas Reed broke his biscuit into 3 pieces instead of 2. He didn't notice he was doing it, the unconscious behavior of someone rationing, stretching, making something last, because lasting was not guaranteed. Margaret noticed. She filed it. Hank Dooley cleaned his plate. Looked at the pot. Looked at it again, like he was having a private negotiation with himself. Then he said with great casualness, "Is there more?" "There's more," Margaret said from the kitchen doorway. He served himself without looking at her. She watched them from the doorway, not with satisfaction exactly, but with the specific focused attention of a woman reading a room. Who reached for seconds, who ate slowly, who held their fork like they hadn't held silverware in a while. Who sat nearest the door, who sat furthest from the window. Caleb ate without speaking, which she understood was what he always did. But twice she counted both times he looked up from his plate toward the kitchen doorway. Both times she had already looked away. After supper, the men cleared out with the same efficiency they'd arrived with. Margaret washed the dishes herself, reorganized 3 of the shelves while the water was still hot, and wrote 4 pages of notes in the small notebook she kept in her apron pocket. Caleb found her still there at 9 o'clock. "You should rest," he said. "Almost done. You cooked, served, and cleaned. That's a full day." "I'm reorganizing the pantry." She didn't stop writing. "If I don't understand the supplies, I can't plan. If I can't plan, I can't feed 12 men properly day after day. And if I can't do that," she paused, found the entry she was looking for, made a note. "Then what exactly am I doing here?" Silence from the doorway. She turned around. Caleb was watching her with an expression she hadn't learned to read yet. There were layers to this man that she could see the edges of without being able to see the whole, and she had the instinct, the particular instinct she had developed for people who had been hurt enough to become careful that whatever was underneath those layers was not simple and was not nothing. "You don't have to prove anything tonight," he said. "I'm not proving anything," she said. "I'm working." "There's a difference." He was quiet for a moment. "The lamp oil burns low in this kitchen. Don't stay up until you run out." He went to bed. She finished the inventory at 10, went to the small cedar smelling room that had been set aside for her, sat on the edge of the bed in the dark, and said out loud to nobody, "All right, Margaret. You're here now. Figure out what needs doing." Then she lay down and went to sleep. She did not let herself think about what she had left behind to get here. That was a door she kept shut. Elias Carter came for her on the second day. She was at the work table at 7:30, dicing onion for the midday meal, when she heard him in the doorway, the specific sound of a large man making himself take up space in a room he wasn't sure he belonged in. "I want you to know," he said, "I've got nothing personal against you." She kept chopping. "All right, I've run this ranch 22 years, he said. "I know what works here. I know what doesn't. The men don't need someone in here making things complicated." "I'm making onion soup," she said. "I'm talking about more than soup." She set the knife down, turned around, looked at him fully, the complete unhurried look that she's learned to give people who needed to understand they were being seen clearly. "Mr. Carter," she said, "I have cooked for people who were more desperate than your crew and more hostile than you're being right now. I'm not here to coddle anyone. I'm here to feed people well. If that happens to make them feel like someone in this world notices them." She picked the knife back up. "I won't be apologizing for it." Elias stared at her. "Supper's at 6, he said finally. "I know," she said to the onion. He left. But Margaret had caught it, the thing he hadn't said, underneath the thing he had. Elias Carter wasn't worried about the crew being coddled. Elias Carter was worried about something changing. About a ranch that had been running in a particular way for 22 years suddenly having a variable in it that he hadn't accounted for. She understood that feeling. She had been that variable her entire life. The cruelty came on day 9, and it came from a direction she hadn't fully prepared for. She was carrying a pot of hot water across the yard toward the wash house when she heard them. 2 of the younger hands, she had learned their names by then, Billy Marsh and a boy everyone called Coop, behind the barn, voices low and loose the way voices get when men think no one is listening. "Tell you what Caleb paid for her. I'd have sent her straight back." Low laughter. "Hell, she can cook. I'll give her that. But you see the size of her? Man must have been desperate. Or blind." More laughter. "Poor woman probably thought this was her chance, you know. Nobody else was going to take her." Margaret stopped walking. She stood in the yard with the pot of hot water in both hands and the sun on the back of her neck and the laughter still moving through the air around her. And she felt it the way she had always felt it, not as a fresh wound. Because this wound was not fresh, but as the reopening of something old and practiced and so deeply familiar that her body knew exactly what to do with it. She did not put the pot down. She did not turn toward the barn. She walked to the wash house, set the pot inside, and went back to the kitchen. She stood at the stove for a moment with both hands flat on the work table and breathed. Once, twice, then she began preparing lunch. Because this was what she had learned, in 26 years of being the woman who was too much in some ways and not enough in others, that the only answer she had ever found to that kind of cruelty was not to crumble and not to fight, but to keep being exactly who she was, so relentlessly and so well, that eventually the people saying those things had to choose between their opinion of her and the evidence in front of them. She had never managed it in every room she'd ever been in. But she intended to manage it here. She put the water on. Began rolling dough. And somewhere in the yard, Billy Marsh and the boy called Coop went quiet in the way that people went quiet when they couldn't hear what they were listening for anymore. Thomas Reed was the first one she understood. He was 20 years old, slight, with the careful eyes of a boy who had learned young that the world was not reliably generous and had made his adjustments accordingly. He ate fast, he sat near the door, and he took bread not greedily, not obviously, but in the particular way of someone for whom enough had been a temporary condition often enough that having it now didn't feel safe to trust. She didn't say a word about it. She simply began making more bread. On the 5th morning, before first light, she came out of the kitchen with a plate of fresh cornbread and found him already sitting in the yard on an upturned crate, hat in his hands. Not sleeping and not doing anything else, either just existing in the dark, the way young men did when their thoughts were too loud for the bunkhouse. She set the plate beside him without a word. 10 minutes later, when she came back with coffee, the cornbread was gone and Thomas was gone, and she didn't think about it again until breakfast. When she set the biscuits on the table and he looked up at her the first time he had looked directly at her since she'd arrived and gave one small nod, barely a movement at all. She nodded back. Something settled between them, not friendship exactly. Not yet, but the beginning of something that had the shape of trust. Hank Dooley broke on a Saturday afternoon. He came into the kitchen while she was wrestling with a pie crust that was not cooperating. And he stood in the doorway, doing the specific thing men did when they had come to say something and were reconsidering whether they'd made the right decision. "The stew you made Thursday," he said. She didn't look up. "What about it?" "My mother made something like that." He'd stopped. "Same smell when the pot got going." "Time," she said. "And a splash of vinegar near the end. Most people skip it." He was quiet. "Yeah," he said. "Well, he said nothing else." He left. Margaret stared at the doorway for a moment. Then she looked at the pie crust and said Thursday. More stew. Remember that. The storm came on day 21 without warning. It dropped off the mountains fast and mean and cold, and the men it caught outside came back to the bunkhouse wet to the bone. Pete Calloway had a gash on his forearm from a fence wire that had snapped in the wind, not deep, but ugly and dirty, and bleeding steadily through the rag he'd wrapped around it. Margaret had already started broth. She couldn't have said why something in the color of the afternoon sky had told her, the way her mother's kitchen instincts had told her mother, passed down through years of women who learned to read weather because the men in their lives needed feeding, regardless of what the sky decided to do. She came out of the kitchen and found Pete in the doorway of the bunkhouse and said, "Come inside." "Kitchen table." He looked at her. "It's just a cut." "It's dirty," she said. "Come inside." He came. She sat him at the kitchen table and cleaned the wound with the calm competence of a woman who had managed worse in worse circumstances, wrapped it clean and tight, and handed him a cup of broth without asking if he wanted it. When she looked up, the doorway was full. Every man on the crew was standing there, wet and cold, and not quite willing to admit either thing. "The kitchen's warm," she said. without looking up from the bandage. Cups are on the shelf. Don't stand in the door letting the cold in. They came inside. All of them. Even Elias Carter, who stood against the far wall with his arms folded like a man trying very hard not to admit he was grateful for anything, took the cup she held out to him and drank it without argument. Caleb arrived 20 minutes later, still wet from the north pasture, and stopped in the doorway of his own kitchen. 12 men. Low voices, cups of hot broth, the particular atmosphere of people who have just been taken care of, and are not entirely sure how to carry that. He looked at Margaret. She looked at him from across the room. "There's enough if you want some," she said. He crossed the room. She handed him a cup. Their fingers touched. Neither of them moved away quickly. Neither of them said anything about it, but across the room Thomas Reed saw it. And Elias Carter saw it. And Hank Dooley, who saw most things and said too many of them, looked down into his cup and said absolutely nothing at all, which was its own kind of answer. That night was when it happened, after the men went back to the bunkhouse. After the kitchen was clean, after the broth pot was washed and the cups were back on the shelf. Margaret was at the work table with her notebook, writing by lamplight, when she heard boots on the porch. Caleb opened the back door. He had changed out of his wet clothes, but he hadn't gone to bed. He stood in the doorway looking at her, the way he had been looking at her all evening, like a man trying to solve an equation he didn't have all the numbers for. "You should sleep," he said. "You keep saying that. You keep ignoring it." "I keep having things to finish," she said. She didn't look up from the notebook. "Mr. Whitmore, was there something you needed? Or did you come back down here just to tell me to go to bed again?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Why did you really come here?" She looked up. He was watching her steadily. The way he watched things he was trying to understand, not unkindly, but without any effort to pretend the question was smaller than it was. "The agency sends women to plenty of men," he said. "You could have gone somewhere easier than Montana Territory. Someone with a smaller operation closer to a town." "Why here?" She held his gaze. "Why did you send for someone?" "I asked you first, and I'm asking you second." The lamp flickered between them. He crossed the room and sat down on the other side of the work table, something he had never done, had never come close to doing, in the entire time she had been here, and he set his hands flat on the surface and said, "I had a wife. 7 years ago. He stopped. She was not built for this place. She tried, it wasn't enough. She got sick in the second winter and she was gone by spring." He looked at the table. "I swore I wouldn't bring another woman out here. I held to that for 6 years. And then I looked at this place, at the crew, at the books, at everything running and nothing living, and I thought if I waited for the right reason, I'd wait until there was nothing left worth running." The kitchen was very quiet. "So you sent for someone practical," Margaret said. "I sent for someone who could survive," he said. "I didn't think about much beyond that." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "My mother died 2 years ago. She was the last person I had. There was a man before I came here. There was a man who said he wanted to marry me, and I believed him for long enough that it mattered. And then I found out he'd been telling people privately that he was only considering it because he needed someone to run his household, and nobody else had offered." She didn't look away from Caleb. "So I came here, because at least here nobody pretended the arrangement was something it wasn't." Caleb looked at her. "I'm sorry," he said, "about the man." "I'm past it," she said. "Are you a pause?" "Most days," she said. He nodded slowly. He stood up. He was almost to the door when he stopped with his hand on the frame and said, without turning around, "You're not what I expected, Miss Holloway." "I know," she said. "I mean that." He seemed to search for the word. "I mean it as something good." She looked at his back, at the set of his shoulders, at the way he held the door frame like he needed something solid. "Mr. Whitmore," she said. "What's your first name?" He turned. The question had surprised him. She could see it. Nobody on this ranch called him anything but Caleb or boss, and she had been calling him Mr. Whitmore since she arrived, and the fact that she was asking now, in this kitchen, at this hour, meant something that neither of them was ready to say out loud. "Caleb," he said. "Caleb," she repeated like she was deciding whether it fit. "Good night." He stood in the doorway for one more moment. "Good night, Margaret," he said. It was the first time he had used her name. She sat very still after he left. The lamp threw long shadows across the work table. Outside, the storm was completely gone, and the Montana sky had cleared to the specific dark clarity that only came after something had been washed clean. She looked at her notebook. On the open page she had written Thomas bread. Hank Thursday bandage. Elias watching. Caleb underneath she wrote 2 words, said my name. She closed the notebook. She sat in the warm kitchen for a long moment, in the particular silence of a woman who has just understood that something she had arrived here not expecting to feel had quietly, without permission, already begun. She did not let herself follow that thought all the way to the end. Not yet, but she did not push it away either. And somewhere across the dark yard, in the bunkhouse, Billy Marsh was telling Coop in a low voice that the new bride was probably too soft to last another month, and neither of them noticed that Hank Dooley, lying on his bunk 3 feet away with his eyes on the ceiling, had gone very still. Because Hank had eaten her food every day for 3 weeks. And Hank knew something Billy Marsh did not. That woman wasn't going anywhere. And God help anyone on this ranch who hadn't figured that out yet. The morning after Caleb said her name, Margaret woke before the rooster and lay in the dark for exactly 30 seconds thinking about it. Then she got up, put her feet on the cold floor, and went to start the coffee. That was what she did with things she couldn't afford to think about too carefully. She moved, she worked, she put her hands on something useful and let the motion of it carry her past whatever feeling was trying to take root in her chest before it grew deep enough to matter. The kitchen at 4:30 in the morning was hers in a way no other hour gave her. The ranch was dark and silent around her, and the only sounds were the stove catching and the first crack of the coffee pot and the wind off the mountains, doing what Montana wind always did, reminding everything below it of its own smallness. She had learned in 3 weeks that this land did not comfort you. It challenged you. Every single morning it asked the same question, "Are you still here?" And the only answer it respected was showing up. She was showing up. She had biscuits in the oven, and a pot of oats on the stove, and the coffee fully made by the time she heard the first boot on the porch steps. It was Thomas, it was always Thomas, up before the others, out in the yard before there was light enough to work by, doing the thing young men did when sleep was complicated by thoughts they hadn't learned to manage yet. He came through the kitchen door, stopped when he saw the spread of breakfast already laid out, and said, "You're up early." "I'm always up early," she said, "earlier than usual, I mean." She handed him a cup of coffee without being asked. "Drink that before you go back out. It's cold this morning." He took it, didn't leave immediately. Stood at the edge of the kitchen the way he'd been doing more and more lately, not quite entering, not quite going in the particular way of a young man who wanted conversation, but had no practice asking for it. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You can ask." "Why do you do all this?" He made a vague gesture that took in the kitchen, the biscuits, the oats, the pre-dawn hour. "You don't have to start this early. Nobody would say anything if breakfast was a little late." Margaret turned and looked at him. "Thomas, when's the last time somebody made sure you ate before you went out in the cold?" He opened his mouth, closed it. The question had landed somewhere undefended. "That's why," she said. "Drink your coffee." He drank his coffee. And when he left, she noticed he took an extra biscuit in his coat pocket without asking, and she noticed she had already made enough for exactly that. The rest of the crew filed in at 5:30, like they always did, Pete with his bandaged arm held slightly away from his body, Hank with his hat already on though he was still inside, Elias last. The way a man came in last when he wanted to see the shape of a room before he committed to being in it. They ate. The biscuits were gone in minutes. The oats didn't last much longer. and something Margaret had been quietly watching for 3 weeks was becoming impossible to ignore. The crew was arriving earlier each morning. Not much. 5 minutes, then 10, then 15. They were looking forward to it. That was not a small thing. These were men who had been running on routine and stubbornness for years. Men who ate because they had to, slept because they had to, worked because the land demanded it. The idea that any part of the day might be something they actually wanted that was new, and it was changing something in the architecture of the place, slowly and without anyone naming it. Elias noticed. Of course he did. Elias noticed everything. He noticed it and said nothing, and watched Margaret with the particular expression of a man whose argument was losing ground, and who was not yet ready to admit it. The trouble with Vivian Caldwell started on a Wednesday. Margaret heard the buggy before she saw it, the sound of good wheels on the road that led up from town, moving with the confidence of someone who came here often enough to not slow down at the gate. She was in the yard at the time, carrying a basket of herbs she'd found growing wild on the eastern edge of the property, which she'd been planning to dry and add to the kitchen stores. The woman who stepped out of that buggy was everything the frontier could produce when it decided to put its best effort forward. Vivian Caldwell was 40 years old and looked 35 in the precise way that money made possible, dressed in deep green wool that had no business being this far from a city, with dark hair arranged under a hat that was worth more than Margaret's entire wardrobe. She moved like a woman who had never once wondered if she was welcome somewhere, because she never had been unwelcome anywhere she'd chosen to go. She looked at Margaret the way certain women looked at certain other women, the quick, complete, dismissive survey that took in everything and assigned a value in under 3 seconds. "You must be the new housekeeper," Vivian said. Margaret held the basket of herbs. "I'm Mr. Whitmore's wife," she said. Margaret. Something shifted in Vivian's expression, just a flicker, a momentary break in the composure, before it sealed back over smooth as river ice. "Of course," she said. Her smile didn't change. "How lovely." Caleb mentioned he'd made an arrangement. Arrangement. The word was chosen precisely, and they both knew it. "He did," Margaret said. "Can I help you with something, Mrs. Caldwell?" "Miss," she said. "Miss Caldwell. And I've been calling on Broken Willow for years, so please don't trouble yourself on my account. I know the way." She moved toward the house like the conversation was finished. "Is Caleb inside?" "He's in the north pasture," Margaret said. "He won't be back until supper." Vivian stopped, turned. And this time the smile was different, thinner, colder, with something underneath it that was neither polite nor accidental. "Then I'll wait," she said. She waited in the front parlor for an hour and a half. Margaret brought her tea once, because that was what you did, and Vivian accepted it without looking up from the small book she'd produced from her bag, and the silence between them was the kind that had weight. When Caleb came in, Margaret was in the kitchen and could hear the conversation through the wall, not the words, but the tone. Vivian's voice bright and warm and familiar. Caleb's voice lower, less easy, with the specific restraint of a man navigating something he wanted to navigate carefully. Vivian left an hour later. Margaret was still in the kitchen when Caleb appeared in the doorway, and she could tell by the set of his jaw that the conversation had cost him something. "She comes by often?" Margaret said without turning from the stove. "Used to," he said. "Before what?" A pause. "Before you arrived." Margaret turned around and looked at him. He met her eyes without flinching, which she had come to understand was his way of telling the truth. "She thought the arrangement might not hold," Margaret said. "Vivian thinks a great many things," he said. "She's not always right." Was she right about this one? He crossed the room, poured himself a cup of coffee from the pot she'd left on the stove, and said, without looking at her, "No." She was not. He took the coffee and went back to work. Margaret stood in the kitchen for a moment, looking at the door he'd left through. Then she turned back to the stove, and something in her chest that had been held carefully at a distance took one small step closer to where she was standing. She would not let herself trust it yet, but she stopped actively pushing it away. Vivian came back on Friday. This time she didn't wait for Caleb. She came into the kitchen, walked in, like it was still the house she'd been visiting for years. Like woman standing at the stove was a temporary inconvenience rather than a permanent resident, and sat herself at the work table with the posture of a woman who had never once been told to leave a room and intended to keep that record clean. "I'll be honest with you," Vivian said, "because I think you deserve that." Margaret kept stirring. "All right. Caleb has been alone a long time," Vivian said. "He is not an easy man. He is not a warm man. He has a beautiful piece of land and a crew that respects him, and a capacity for grief that most people in this county have never seen the full extent of. And he deserves someone who understands all of that." She paused. "I'm not sure that person arrived on a stagecoach from back east." Margaret set down the spoon, turned around, looked at Vivian Caldwell with the full, steady attention she had used on Elias Carter, on Billy Marsh's laughter in the yard, on every person who had ever looked at her and decided her size or her softness was the sum of her. "Miss Caldwell," she said, "I appreciate the honesty. So I'll offer you some in return." She folded her hands on the work table and leaned forward slightly. "I'm not here to compete with you. I'm here because Caleb sent for me and I came, and what happens between him and me is not something you get a vote on. But I'll tell you this, and I'll tell you only once: I am not temporary. I am not an arrangement that fails quietly, and if you come into my kitchen again to tell me what my husband deserves, you will leave it faster than you arrived." She held Vivian's gaze. "Do you take sugar in your tea?" Vivian stared at her. "I'll take that as a no," Margaret said, and turned back to the stove. Vivian left. Margaret heard her buggy on the road, moving faster than it had on the way in. She exhaled once, slow and controlled, and went back to the stew. From the doorway behind her, a voice said, "Lord Almighty." She turned. Hank Dooley was standing in the doorway with both eyebrows up near his hairline and an expression of complete and undisguised admiration. "How long have you been standing there?" she said. "Long enough," he said. He pointed at the stew. "Is that the time one?" "Yes." "Good," he said, and sat down at the kitchen table like he had been sitting there his whole life. "Because I think I need to eat something after that." Margaret looked at him for a moment. Then she got him a bowl. And that was the afternoon that Hank Dooley stopped being a man who tolerated her presence, and became something that would eventually, in its own rough and unspoken way, become something close to an ally. The twist that nobody saw coming arrived on a Tuesday morning, in the form of a letter. Margaret found it on the kitchen table when she came down at 4:30. Caleb must have left it there the night before, or early that morning, because it hadn't been there when she went to bed. A thick envelope already opened with a law firm's name printed on the outside from a city back east. She would not have looked at it, would have left it exactly where it was, except that it had been left open and face up in a way that felt deliberate. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she picked it up. The letter was from the agency that had arranged their marriage. It was addressed to Caleb, and the relevant paragraph, the one that made her hand go still on the paper, read as follows: "Mr. Whitmore, we write to inform you that the placement of Miss Margaret Holloway with your household was made under an error of documentation. Miss Holloway's original application was filed under a different name due to a clerical discrepancy at our Chicago office. We are prepared to assist in arranging her return and processing a new placement at no additional cost to you, should you determine that the current arrangement is not satisfactory." Margaret read it twice. She set it back on the table exactly where she had found it. She stood at the stove and started the coffee, and did not allow herself to feel anything about it yet, because the feeling was too large and too complicated, and the biscuits needed to go in by 5 o'clock, or they wouldn't be done by 5:30. She made the biscuits. She made the oats. She poured the coffee. She had the full breakfast laid out by 5:25, and had not cried and had not broken a single dish, which she considered a personal achievement. It was Thomas who saw her face when she set down the coffee pot at the table, Thomas, who had learned to read her the way she had learned to read all of them. in the specific unconscious way of people who pay attention to each other without meaning to. "Hey," he said quietly, while the other men were still settling. "You all right?" "Fine," she said. He looked at her for a second longer. He said nothing else, but she saw him glance at the kitchen doorway, and then at Caleb's empty chair at the head of the table. Caleb was always the last one in, and something in Thomas Reed's young face went careful and watchful, in the way of a person deciding to pay attention. Caleb came in at 5:32, sat down, poured his coffee, looked at the table and nodded her, which told her everything. He knew she'd seen it. He'd wanted her to see it. She didn't know yet if that made it better or worse. She found out at noon the crew was out. The kitchen was empty. She was at the work table with a pot of beans when Caleb came in, not passing through, not filling a cup, but coming in with the specific intention of a man who had been working himself up to something for several hours. He sat down across from her. She kept her eyes on the beans. "You read the letter," he said. "It was open," she said. "I know. I left it open." She looked up at that. He was watching her steadily, the way he always watched the things he needed to understand. "Why?" she said. "Because I didn't want you to find out some other way," he said. "And because I thought you deserved to know before I told you what I intend to do about it." She set down the spoon. "What do you intend to do about it?" "Nothing," he said. The word landed in the kitchen like a stone dropping into still water. "Caleb, I'm not sending you back," he said. "I don't care what name they filed the paperwork under. That letter can go in the stove for all it matters to me." He paused. "What matters is whether it matters to you." She stared at him. "I want to know if you want to stay," he said. "Not because you have nowhere else to go. Not because the arrangement says you should, but because you want to." His jaw was set, but his eyes had something in them she hadn't seen before, something raw and unguarded that he was allowing on purpose. The way a man who has learned to be careful about his own face allows something through when the moment requires it. "So I'm asking, do you want to stay?" The beans were getting cold. "You read the letter too," she said. "The part about the name." "Yes. And it doesn't bother you that the agency made a mistake, that I might not be exactly who you asked for?" He was quiet for a moment. "Were you dishonest with me?" "No. Did you put a different name on the application?" "No, it was a clerical error. I had no knowledge of it." "Then it doesn't bother me," he said. "I didn't fall into an arrangement with a piece of paper. I fell into it with the woman standing in front of me." "And the woman standing in front of me," he stopped. Something moved across his face. "She is exactly who I would have asked for," he said. "If I'd known enough to ask correctly." Margaret sat very still. She had spent 26 years waiting for rooms to tell her she was worth staying in. This was a room telling her, "Yes," she said, "I want to stay." He nodded once, the compact nod of a man who has received the answer he needed and knows better than to push past it before it settles. "Good," he said. He got up, put his hat on, went back to work. Margaret sat at the kitchen table for a long moment after he left. She looked at the pot of beans, which were in fact getting cold. She went back to making lunch, but something in the way she stood at the stove had changed. Something in her spine, something in the angle of her shoulders. The particular change that happens to a person when a space they have been occupying carefully, with one hand always near the door, suddenly becomes a place they are allowed to inhabit fully. She planted her feet. She was staying. Word traveled the way words traveled in small places, which was to say faster than anyone intended and wider than anyone planned. By Thursday, 2 of the ranch hands had heard from someone in town that Caleb Whitmore had received a letter from the agency offering to take back his wife. By Friday, that someone in town had told Vivian Caldwell. By Saturday, Vivian had told 4 other people, each of whom had their own theories about what it meant, and what Caleb would do, and what the quiet woman in that kitchen was actually worth to a man like him. Margaret heard none of this directly. She heard it the way she always heard things, in the changed quality of silences, In the careful way certain men looked at her and then looked away. In the specific way Elias Carter came into the kitchen on Saturday morning and stayed longer than he needed to. He didn't say anything for a while. He drank his coffee. He looked out the window. Then he said, "You staying?" "Yes," she said. He drank his coffee. "Good," he said. That was all. But Elias Carter saying good to the question of whether she was staying meant more than most men's speeches, and she knew it and he knew it, and both of them let the moment stand on its own, without making it larger than it was. The breaking point came on a Sunday. It came from Billy Marsh, who had apparently been building toward it for weeks, the specific simmering resentment of a young man who feels himself being displaced from something he couldn't have articulated but had depended on without knowing it. The ranch hands had been a closed system. Margaret's presence had opened it. And for most of the men, what had come in was warmth and food, and the feeling of being cared for. But for Billy, what had come in was a reminder of something he didn't know how to accept. He waited until supper. He waited until the table was full and the meal was set, and Margaret came out of the kitchen with the last pot, and then he said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "You know they offered to take her back." The table went quiet. Margaret set the pot down. "Heard Caleb got a letter," Billy continued, his voice carrying the specific bravado of a man performing for an audience. "Saying the whole thing was a mistake, that she's not even who she said she was." He looked at her. "So which is it? You here because he wants you, or because you got nowhere else to go?" Every man at that table went still. Thomas Reed's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. Pete Calloway looked at Billy with the specific expression of a man watching someone make a mistake they can't take back. And Elias Carter set down his cup with a sound that was very quiet and very deliberate, and looked at Billy Marsh with 22 years of authority in his eyes, and said, "That's enough. I'm just saying what everyone's thinking. Nobody here is thinking it," Elias said. "And if they were, they'd have the sense not to say it at this table." He looked at Billy for a long, steady moment. "We clear?" Billy's jaw worked. I said, Elias said, "Are we clear?" "Yes, sir," Billy muttered. Elias looked at Margaret. "Sit down and eat," he said, not unkindly, in the way he said things that were simple facts. And Margaret, who had been standing at the end of the table with the pot in her hands and the silence of 12 men around her, pulled out the chair she always sat in and sat down in it. She served herself, she ate, and across the table, Hank Dooley caught her eye and gave a single small nod, the kind of nod that meant, "We see you. We see what just happened, and we are telling you, without making a scene of it, that you are one of us." Margaret nodded back. She was shaking slightly beneath the table, where nobody could see. But her hands on her fork were steady. That was the thing about Margaret Holloway that this ranch had not yet fully understood. Though it was learning, she could be shaking on the inside and steady on the outside. And she had been doing it so long, and so well that most people never knew the difference. But Caleb knew. He was sitting at the head of the table, and he had seen Billy's jaw tighten when she first walked in, and he had let Elias handle it because Elias had done it faster and better than he could have. And now he was watching Margaret eat her supper with her back straight and her hands steady, and the particular dignity of a woman who had decided that this table was hers, and no amount of cruelty was going to make her stand up from it. After supper, after the men had gone, after the kitchen was clean, Caleb came in and found her at the work table again. He sat down across from her. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then she said, "You knew he was going to do that." "I suspected. Why didn't you say something yourself?" He was quiet. "Then because Elias saying it means more to them than me saying it. They know I'm invested. They know what I think. Elias saying it means the whole table said it." He looked at her. "And they needed to say it. Not for you, for themselves. So they'd know what kind of men they are." She looked at him across the work table. At this man who spoke rarely and thought constantly and understood things about people that most people never bothered to figure out. "You're smarter than you let on," she said. "So are you," he said. She almost smiled. "Not quite almost." "Go to bed, Caleb," she said. He stood, put on his hat, stopped at the door. Margaret. Yes? What Billy said about nowhere else to go. He looked at her over his shoulder. That's not why you're here. I know that. I want you to know I know that. She held his eyes. I know you know, she said. He left. She sat in the kitchen with the lamp burning low and her notebook open and the wide Montana night pressing against the window, and she thought about a ranch that had been running for 20 years on stubbornness and survival. And 12 men who were slowly, without anyone making a speech about it, becoming something more than workers passing through. And a man at the head of a table who was slowly, without either of them naming it, becoming something more than a practical arrangement. She did not write any of this in her notebook. Some things were too fragile to put in writing before they were fully real. She blew out the lamp, she went to bed, and in the morning, she got up before the rooster, started the coffee, and got to work. Because that was who Margaret Holloway was, and Broken Willow Ranch was beginning at long last to understand it. 3 weeks after the letter, after Billy Marsh's supper table humiliation, after Elias Carter's 2-word verdict and Caleb's quiet declaration at the work table, 3 weeks after all of that, Broken Willow Ranch had settled in something nobody quite had a name for, yet but everyone could feel. It was not peace exactly. It was something more alive than peace. It was the feeling of a place that had been running on empty for so long it had forgotten what full felt like, and was now, slowly and almost suspiciously, beginning to remember. The men arrived to meals early. Not all of them, not all at once, but consistently enough that it was no longer a surprise. Thomas Reed had started staying after supper to help clear the table, not because anyone asked him, but because he wanted to be in the kitchen a little longer. In the specific way of young men who have found a warm place and don't know how to leave it gracefully. Pete Calloway's arm had healed clean, and he'd told her so with the directness of a man who didn't give compliments easily but gave facts readily. Hank Dooley had taken to appearing in the kitchen doorway at random hours with no stated purpose, occasionally offering an opinion on whatever she was cooking, occasionally saying nothing at all and just standing there like the kitchen was a place he needed to be near. Even Elias Carter had shifted. Not warmly, Elias Carter did not do warmth the way other men did. But he had stopped standing in doorways watching her with calculation, and started standing in doorways watching her with something that looked, if you knew how to read him, remarkably like respect. Margaret noticed all of it. She catalogued it the way she catalogued everything, quietly, precisely, without making a production of it. What she did not catalogue, because she did not trust herself to look at it directly yet, was the way Caleb Whitmore had started lingering. Not dramatically, not obviously. But where before he had come through the kitchen with purpose, a cup of coffee, a supply question, a piece of information that needed conveying, now he sometimes came through with nothing particular to say, and stayed anyway. He would sit at the work table and drink his coffee slowly, and occasionally make a comment about the weather or the cattle or something one of the men had said, and she would respond. And they would talk for 5 or 10 minutes in the low, easy way of people who had gotten comfortable with each other's silences, and then he would go. She told herself it was practical. 2 people sharing a household, learning each other's rhythms. She told herself that every single morning, and believed it a little less each time. It was Thomas who said it out loud first, because Thomas had the specific honesty of the very young and the very perceptive, and had not yet learned that some things were better left unobserved. He said it on a Thursday morning when it was just the 2 of them in the kitchen, the way it sometimes was at that early hour. And Caleb had just left after an unusually long cup of coffee, during which he and Margaret had talked about everything and nothing for nearly 20 minutes. Thomas watched him go, then he looked at Margaret. Then he looked back at the door. He doesn't do that with anyone else, Thomas said. Do what? Margaret said, not turning from the stove. Come in here and just talk, Thomas said. He doesn't do that. I've been here 2 years. I've never seen him just sit somewhere and talk. He was asking about the supply list, Margaret said. Thomas was quiet for a moment. The supply list, he repeated, with the tone of a 19-year-old who knew exactly what he was looking at and was too polite to press it further. "Drink your coffee," Margaret said. He drank his coffee. But he was smiling when he did it, and she could see it from the corner of her eye, and she did not say anything about that either. The county eye gathering was Vivian Caldwell's idea. That was what Margaret learned later, that the annual harvest gathering, which had apparently been a fixture in this county for 20 years, had been organized this particular year by Vivian, with a precision and an intention that had nothing to do with community spirit and everything to do with the quiet war she had decided to wage in the most public arena available to her. Margaret learned this from Hank, who learned it from a man in town, who had heard it from the wife of the county judge, and by the time it reached Margaret, it had been through enough hands that she couldn't be certain of its exact shape. But the core of it was this: Vivian had arranged for a chef from Helena, a trained, experienced, professionally credentialed city chef, to prepare the meal at the county gathering. And she had done it, as far as anyone could tell, specifically because she had heard that Broken Willow Ranch was going to contribute food to the gathering. Specifically because she had heard Margaret was going to cook. Caleb told her himself, 3 days before the gathering. He came into the kitchen in the evening, sat down at the work table, and laid it out plainly because he was a man who didn't dress up bad news. "Vivian's brought in someone from Helena," he said. "A chef. For the gathering." Margaret kept her hands on the bread she was kneading. "I heard you heard," Hank told me. He was quiet for a moment. "You don't have to contribute anything," he said. "Nobody would think less of you for sitting this one out." "It's Vivian." Margaret said yes. She turned the bread. "Caleb, do you know why I always find the kitchen first when I walk into a new place?" He waited. "Because the kitchen tells you what the house is afraid of," she said. "A kitchen where nobody cooks real food is a house afraid of need. Afraid of admitting that people get hungry, that people need comfort, that caring for someone takes time and intention." She dusted her hands on her apron. "Vivian bringing in a chef from Helena is the same thing. She's afraid that what I make means something she doesn't know how to make." She looked at Caleb. "I'm not sitting anything out." He looked at her for a long moment. "All right," he said. "I'll need a few things from town," she said, and handed him a list she had already written. He took it, looked at it, looked at her. "You already knew," he said. "Hank told me 3 days ago," she said. Something that was almost a smile crossed his face. "Almost. What are you making?" "What my mother made," she said. What her mother made. What women in this country have been making since before anyone built a city in Helena and called it civilization. He stood up, put his hat on. "I'll get the supplies tomorrow." "Thank you," she said. He was at the door when she said, "Caleb." He turned. "Don't worry about it," she said. "I know what I'm doing." He looked at her with those steady, layered eyes. "I know you do," he said. "That's not what I'm worried about." He left, and she stood in the kitchen alone, wondering what exactly he meant by that, and decided she would think about it after the gathering. The day of the county gathering arrived cold and bright, the specific clarity of a Montana autumn morning that made everything look sharp and certain. Margaret had been up since 3. She had made 4 loaves of bread, the kind with a crackling crust and a soft, dense interior that pulled apart in steam when you broke it open. She had made a stew that had been simmering since the night before, built on a bone broth she'd started 2 days ahead, with root vegetables and slow-cooked beef and the particular combination of herbs that she had learned, through years of practice, created something that was not just food but memory. She had made 2 apple pies using the last of the autumn apples, with a crust that was her grandmother's recipe, which required cold butter and patience and a specific kind of faith that the dough would come together even when it looked like it wouldn't. She had made what she always made, what she knew. Thomas helped her load everything into the wagon. He handled the pots with the careful seriousness of someone transporting something valuable. Pete came and helped without being asked, and then Hank, and by the time the wagon was loaded, 5 of the 12 ranch hands were standing in the yard in their Sunday clothes, looking like they intended to come along, which nobody had arranged and nobody needed to say anything about. Elias appeared last, hat in hand, looked at the wagon. "Looked at," Margaret said. "Looks like we're all going." "Looks like," she said. Caleb brought the wagon around. He looked at the crew assembled in the yard, with something in his expression that was private and complicated, and he looked at Margaret, and he said simply, "Ready." "Ready," she said. She climbed up onto the wagon seat. He drove, and the whole crew of Broken Willow Ranch rode into town together, which, as several people in town would later comment, was something Caleb Whitmore had never done before in 22 years. Not once. Not for anything. The gathering was held in the large open space behind the county meeting hall, which had been decorated with the cheerful determination of people who understood that community required effort and were willing to provide it. There were tables and lanterns and the smell of wood fires and the low roar of 100 conversations happening at once. And there, at the center of the food area, was the chef from Helena. His name, Margaret learned, was Mr. Garrison, and he was everything his reputation suggested: a compact, efficient man in a white coat who moved around his preparation area with the confidence of someone who had cooked for people who paid a great deal to eat. He had equipment that Margaret had never owned and ingredients that had clearly been brought in from somewhere that was not a frontier pantry. He had 3 assistants. He had a plan, and the plan was working, and the food coming out of his station was technically impressive in a way that was impossible to dispute. Vivian Caldwell stood nearby, watching with the satisfaction of a woman who believed she had already won. She looked at Margaret's contribution: the bread, the stew, the pie, all of it simple and plain, and without a single impressive presentation, and something in her expression said, clearly and without words, "Is that all?" Margaret set up her table. She did not respond to the expression. She had spent her life not responding to that expression. The first person who came to her table was an old woman Margaret had never met, who looked at the bread and said, "My lord." "Is that sourdough?" "It is," Margaret said. The woman picked up a piece, broke it, smelled it, and her eyes closed for exactly 1 second. "My grandmother made this," she said. "I haven't smelled this in 40 years. "Sit down," Margaret said. "Let me get you a bowl of the stew." The old woman sat down, and then the person behind her came. And then the person behind that person. It was not a rush, not at first. It was the organic, undramatic movement of people following their noses and their instincts, the way people had always found food that meant something to them. Mr. Garrison's station was impressive, and plenty of people went there and ate his food and said appropriate things about it. But Margaret's table had a line by 11 o'clock that bent around the side of the building, and it was not made up of people who were hungry. It was made up of people who were homesick for something they couldn't name. She had seen it before, that look on people's faces when food reached a place that had nothing to do with hunger. It was a softening, a going quiet, the sudden presence of something that had been absent, some comfort or safety or memory that had been folded up and put away and was now, unexpectedly, being handed back. She kept filling bowls. She kept cutting bread. Thomas stood beside her refilling the bread basket, and Hank stood on the other side, doing absolutely nothing useful except being there, which she understood was his way of saying something he didn't have words for. It was the county judge, a large gray-haired man named Harlan Webb, who had been judging everything in this county for 30 years, and had the specific bearing of a man who had earned the right to say what he thought, who said it out loud. He came to her table late in the morning, when the line had not shortened, took a bowl of stew and a piece of bread, sat down on a bench nearby, and ate it slowly. Then he came back. He got a second bowl. He sat down again. He ate that one slower than the first. Then he came back to the table and looked at Margaret directly. "Who taught you to cook?" he said. "My mother," she said. "And her mother before that?" He nodded. "Where are you from?" "Ohio, originally. I'm Caleb Whitmore's wife, Margaret." He looked at her the full, considering look of a man who had spent 30 years deciding what things were worth. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "there is a man up the table there who has been cooking for governors and making food that is technically excellent. And there is you who are making food that made my wife cry." He paused. "She hasn't cried at a meal since her mother died. I thought you should know that." Margaret looked at him. "Thank you," she said. "No," he said. "Thank you." He tipped his hat. "A talented cook can impress people for an evening. Someone who can make people feel cared for." He stopped because words were apparently insufficient. "That's a rare thing, Mrs. Whitmore. Rare as I've seen." He walked away. Margaret stood at her table and felt something she had not felt in a long time, not pride exactly, but its more honest cousin. The feeling of being truly seen by someone who had no reason to flatter her. Behind her, very close, a voice said quietly, "You all right?" She turned. Caleb was standing directly behind her, closer than she expected, with his hat in his hands and his eyes on her face. "Fine," she said. "You're shaking," he said. "I'm not." She looked at her hands. They were in fact shaking slightly. He stepped forward, very close, and said in a voice low enough that only she could hear, "You did that. Everything happening at this table right now, you did that." She looked up at him. They were standing close enough that she could see the specific way the autumn light hit the gray at his temples. "I just cooked," she said. "No," he said, "you didn't just cook." He held her eyes. "Don't sell it short, not today." She held his gaze for a long moment. Then from across the gathering, Vivian Caldwell's voice cut through the noise. "Well, Mrs. Whitmore." She was standing 10 feet away, and her composure was intact, and her voice was bright, and her eyes were doing something entirely different. "It seems the ranch cooking has made quite an impression." "It seems so." "Very charming," Vivian said. "Rustic food always has a certain nostalgia appeal. It's not quite the same as trained technique, of course, but for a gathering like this," she made a small gesture that dismissed everything Margaret had built in the last 6 hours. "People do love to be reminded of simpler times." The people around them had gone quiet. Margaret looked at Vivian Caldwell. She thought about all the rooms she had stood in where someone with a pleasant voice had said an unpleasant thing and waited to see if she would make a scene or swallow it. She thought about 30 years of being dismissed before she opened her mouth. She thought about the old woman who had closed her eyes over a piece of bread and smelled her grandmother. "You're right," Margaret said pleasantly. "It's not trained technique. It's something harder to learn than that." She folded her hands. "Technique teaches you how to make food correctly. Nobody can teach you how to make someone feel cared for. You either understand people well enough to do it or you don't." She paused. "I'm glad the food made an impression, Miss Caldwell. I hope you'll have a bowl before it runs out." She turned back to her table. Vivian said nothing. Behind Margaret, Thomas Reed was biting the inside of his cheek so hard it was going to leave a mark. Hank Dooley was looking at the sky with the expression of a man communing privately with God in gratitude. And Elias Carter, standing 10 feet to the left, had the particular stillness of a man who had just watched something he would not forget. Caleb said nothing at all, but when Margaret reached for the ladle, his hand was there first, holding the pot steady. She looked at him. He looked at her. "I've got it," she said. "I know," he said. He didn't move. She filled the bowl. They worked side by side for the next hour without discussing it, and nobody at that gathering missed what it meant that Caleb Whitmore, who had run his ranch alone for 7 years and attended every county gathering for 20, without once standing at anyone's side, was standing at his wife's side now. Not formally, not with announcement, just standing there. Present and deliberate. That was worth more in this county than any speech he could have given. It was on the drive home that the twist came that nobody had anticipated. The crew had ridden ahead. The gathering was winding down. The wagon was loaded with empty pots and a few things people had pressed into Margaret's hands, a jar of honey from one woman, a bundle of dried lavender from another, a handshake from Judge Webb that lasted longer than handshakes usually did. The late afternoon had gone amber and cold, and Margaret sat beside Caleb on the wagon seat with her hands in her lap and the satisfaction of a day's work settling into her bones. They had been riding in comfortable silence for about 10 minutes when Caleb said, "I need to tell you something." She looked at him. His voice had a different quality than it usually did. "All right," she said. He kept his eyes on the road. "The agency letter," he said. "There was more to it than I showed you." She went very still. "There was a second page," he said. "I didn't leave it on the table." "What did it say?" He was quiet for a moment, the way he was quiet when he was putting words together carefully. "It said that the woman who had originally been placed with me, the woman who should have come, had already married someone else before the paperwork was filed. The agency was covering their error. They sent you as a substitute without flagging it, and when they realized the file was wrong, they sent the letter. Margaret processed this, so I was never supposed to come here." That's what they said. She looked at the road ahead, at the mountains going dark at their peaks against the amber sky. "And the second page. Say," he exhaled slowly. "It said the woman who was originally placed her name was also Margaret. Margaret Connolly. She was from Illinois." He paused. "She was a different kind of woman than you. What does that mean?" "She was younger," he said. "She was what I asked for specifically. Small, not much household experience, but from a farming family. Young enough to..." He stopped. Young enough that it seemed practical. The wagon moved. The horses breathed in the cold air. "So you asked for someone young and practical," Margaret said, "and you got me instead." "Yes. And you're telling me this now because I don't want there to be things I haven't told you," he said. He turned and looked at her directly, the way he had looked at her across the work table the night of the storm. "I asked for one thing, and I got something completely different." "And what I got..." He stopped, tried again. "What I got is something I didn't know enough to ask for. And I needed you to know that I know that." Margaret looked at him. "Are you saying you prefer what you got?" she said. "I'm saying there is no comparison," he said. "That's what I'm saying." The road went quiet around them. The mountains held their position. The sky was doing what Montana skies did at this hour, turning colors that had no names in any language Margaret knew. "Caleb," she said, "yes. You are the most complicated, simple man I have ever met." He looked at her for a long moment. Then something happened that she had not seen happen in 2 months of living in close quarters with this man. He laughed. Not loudly, nothing Caleb Whitmore did was loud, but genuinely, with his whole face, the lines under his eyes deepening into something that looked nothing like sorrow. It lasted about 4 seconds, then he was composed again. But those 4 seconds, Margaret stored them in the part of her memory where she kept the things that mattered. She looked back at the road. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "Thank you for not being angry about it," he said. "I'm a little angry about it," she said. "I know," he said. "You're handling it with a great deal of dignity." "I'm handling it with a great deal of effort," she said. "Those are different things." He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said. "They are." They rode the rest of the way home in a silence that was different from all the other silences they'd shared. Warmer, more permissive. The silence of two people who had just told each other a true thing and survived it. The confrontation that nobody planned arrived 3 days later, in the form of 2 men Margaret had never seen before. They rode into the yard on a Wednesday morning while the crew was out and Caleb was in the north pasture, and Margaret was alone in the kitchen. She heard the horses and came out to the porch, and the 2 men dressed well for this country, too well. In the way of men who were from somewhere that had more money than mud, looked at her from their horses, with the polite condescension of people who have come to conduct business and consider everyone else a detail. The taller one said, "We're looking for Caleb Whitmore." "He's not here," Margaret said. "What's your business?" The 2 men exchanged a look. The shorter one said, "We represent the Northern Territories Land Trust." We have a proposition for Mr. Whitmore regarding a purchase offer on this property. Margaret held the porch railing. This property isn't for sale. We haven't discussed the offer yet, the taller one said pleasantly. We'd like to do that with Mr. Whitmore, directly, if you don't mind. When did you plan on being back? The shorter one asked. Not for hours, Margaret said. But you can leave your paperwork with me and I'll make sure he sees it. Another exchange of looks. The tall one reached into his coat and produced a sealed envelope. This is a preliminary offer, he said. He held it out toward her. She came down the steps and took it. We'll return tomorrow morning, the tall one said. We expect Mr. Whitmore will want to discuss the terms. They rode out. Margaret stood in the yard with the envelope in her hands and looked at it for a long moment. Then she went inside. She did not open it. She set it on the work table. She stood looking at it. She thought about everything she had built in 2 months in this kitchen, at this table. In this yard, the bread and the broth and the trust, and the 12 men who had started arriving to meals early, and the one man who had laughed 4 seconds in a wagon and stored it away like it was something worth keeping. She thought about Vivian Caldwell. She thought about the agency letter. She thought about 2 men who had come to buy this land out from under all of it. She went back outside and found Thomas in the barn. Go get Caleb, she said now. Tell him to come home. Thomas looked at her face. He didn't ask why. He saddled his horse and rode. Caleb read the letter twice. Then he set it on the table and looked at it. The crew had drifted in by then. Thomas had apparently said something to Pete on his way past, and Pete had said something to Hank, and so on, until all 12 men were somewhere in or around the kitchen. Arranged in the specific way they arranged themselves when something was happening that involved all of them. What is it? Caleb looked up. Northern Territories Land Trust, he said. They want to buy the ranch. The room went quiet. The offer's generous, Caleb said. It was clear from his voice that generous was not the word he wanted to use. More than the property's worth on paper, which means they think it's worth more than it's worth on paper, Elias said. Which means there's something on this land they want, Hank said. He looked at Caleb. What's on this land? I don't know yet, Caleb said. He looked at the letter. But I know 2 things. 1, he set the letter down flat. This ranch isn't for sale. And 2, Pete said. Caleb looked up. His eyes crossed the room and landed on Margaret, who was standing at the stove where she had been standing through all of this, listening and saying nothing. He held her gaze for 1 moment. 2, he said, somebody sent these men here. And I don't think they found this place on their own. The room absorbed that. Thomas looked at the floor. Pete looked at Caleb. Hank looked at the ceiling, and then at Elias, who was looking at exactly no one, which was how you could tell Elias was thinking hard. Margaret said, from the stove, quietly, Vivian Caldwell owns property adjacent to this land. Every head in the room turned toward her. She has for years, Margaret said. I looked it up at the county office last month when I was in town for supplies. She bought the eastern parcel 6 years ago. She paused. The same parcel that would become significantly more valuable if this ranch were sold to a land trust and the water rights transferred. The silence in the kitchen was the specific silence of 12 men and 1 woman having the same thought at the same time. Caleb looked at her. You went to the county office, he said. I was curious, she said. You were curious, he repeated. I'm a curious person, she said. It's a quality you perhaps underestimated. Hank Dooley said slowly, to no one in particular, I did not see that coming. Neither did Vivian, Margaret said. She turned back to the stove. Supper's in an hour. I suggest everyone stay close. Nobody went anywhere. That night, after supper, after the men had gone to the bunkhouse and the kitchen had been cleaned and the lamp turned low, Caleb sat at the work table and said, How long have you known? Known what specifically? Margaret said that she was behind it. I suspected from the beginning, she said. The timing of her visits. The way she asked about the land, not just about you. The questions she asked that sounded like conversations, but were actually inventory. She sat down across from him. She's not your friend, Caleb. She never was. She wanted this ranch. He was quiet for a moment. And you figured all of that out and didn't say anything. I didn't have proof, she said. I had a feeling and a county record and a pattern. That's not the same as proof. It's more than I had, he said. You weren't looking, she said, not unkindly. You've been running this place alone for so long you stopped expecting anyone to work against you. You just put your head down and worked. She held his eyes. You need someone to look up for you sometimes. He held her gaze across the table for a long moment. Something moved in his face, not the almost smile she'd seen before, not the 4-second laugh from the wagon, but something deeper and quieter than both of those things. Something that was not quite ready to be named, but was no longer willing to stay hidden. Margaret, he said. Yes, I'm glad it was you, he said. That stepped off that coach. I know it wasn't what I asked for. I know you know that, but I am. He stopped. Tried once more. I'm glad it was you. She held very still. Caleb, she said, if you say something like that and then just go to bed, I will put vinegar in your coffee tomorrow morning. He stared at her. Then he said, I'm not going to bed. She waited. He reached across the work table and put his hand over hers. Not dramatically, not with a speech, just his hand, large and calloused and warm, covering hers in the lamplight. She turned her hand over and held on. Outside, the Montana night was doing what it always did, vast and cold and indifferent to the small human warmths happening beneath it. But in the kitchen of Broken Willow Ranch, two people, who had both learned to want less, were sitting at a work table in the lamplight, holding hands, and neither of them was letting go. And across the yard, Hank Dooley was standing outside the bunkhouse, looking at the kitchen window, where the light was still on, and he said to Thomas Reed, who was standing beside him for no particular reason, You see that? Thomas looked at the light. Yeah, he said. Good, Hank said. They went inside. The light in the kitchen stayed on for a long time. The two men from the Northern Territories Land Trust came back the next morning, exactly when they said they would, which told Margaret everything she needed to know about them. Men who arrived exactly on time to deliver bad news were men who had done it before and had learned that punctuality made them feel professional about it. Caleb met them on the porch. Margaret stayed in the kitchen, which was where she had decided to stay, because the kitchen was where she could hear everything through the front wall and also where she could keep her hands busy. And keeping her hands busy was how she kept herself from doing something inadvisable. The taller one said, Mr. Whitmore, have you had a chance to review our offer? I have, Caleb said. And the ranch isn't for sale, Caleb said. A pause. The taller one said pleasantly, We understand that's your initial position. But the offer represents nearly twice the assessed value of the property, and we believe, once you've had time to consider the full terms. I've considered them, Caleb said. The answer is no. Another pause. Longer this time. The shorter one said, Mr. Whitmore, the Land Trust has significant interest in this region. Properties that decline our initial offer often find themselves at a disadvantage when it comes to water rights negotiations in subsequent years. We'd hate to see Broken Willow affected by. Are you threatening me? Caleb said. His voice had not changed volume or temperature. It had simply become a different kind of quiet, the kind that was not soft. Silence from the porch. In the kitchen, Margaret stopped stirring. We're making you aware of the landscape, the tall one said carefully. Nothing more. Then I'll make you aware of something, Caleb said. This ranch has been running on this land for 20 years. We have water rights filed and recorded at the county office going back to the first year of operation. Any attempt to interfere with those rights would require a legal challenge that I am entirely prepared to defend. And I would suggest a pause. That before you threaten any more ranchers in this county, you think carefully about who those ranchers know and how long they've known them. A longer silence. Good day, gentlemen, Caleb said. Boots on the steps, horses in the yard, the sound of two men leaving faster than they arrived. Margaret let out a breath she had been holding for approximately 90 seconds. The back door opened and Caleb came into the kitchen. He looked at her. She looked at him. He poured himself a cup of coffee, sat down at the work table, and said, "That went about how I expected." "The water rights comment," she said. "That was good." "It's true," he said. "We have 20 years of filings." "I know," she said. "I checked them at the county office." He stared at her. "Last month," she said, "when I was also checking the property records." He was quiet for a moment. "Is there anything you haven't checked?" he said. "I haven't checked what Vivian Caldwell paid for the eastern parcel," she said. "But I intend to." He looked at her for a long moment. That full, particular look that she was beginning to understand was his version of being openly astonished. "Margaret," he said. "Yes? What would you have done if I'd sold the ranch?" She turned back to the stove. "I would have been very disappointed in you," she said. "And then I would have figured out what to do next." He was quiet. Then quietly, "You always know what to do next." She turned around. "No," she said, "I always know what to do right now." "That's different. Right now is the only thing I've ever been able to count on." He held her gaze across the kitchen. His hand was flat on the work table. She could see it from where she stood, that large calloused hand that had covered hers the night before, that had held on when she held back. "All right," he said, "what do we do right now?" She set down the spoon. "We find out who sent those men," she said, "and we find out what's on this land that made it worth sending them." It was Hank who found the first piece. Not because Hank was an investigator by nature. Hank was a man who talked to everyone, about everything, constantly, which was an entirely different skill set that happened to produce similar results. He had been to town for supplies on Thursday, and had come back with flour, salt, a new length of rope, and the information that the Northern Territories Land Trust had purchased 3 properties in the county in the past 18 months. All of them adjacent to a proposed rail line extension that had not yet been made public. He delivered this information at supper, between the stew and the bread, in the specific way Hank delivered all information without preamble, at volume, and with the assumption that everyone present would immediately understand why it mattered. "Rail line," he said, "coming through the valley. That's what they're after. Property along the route is going to be worth 3 times what it is now once the announcement comes." The table went silent. Thomas said, "How do you know about the rail line?" "Talk to a man at the feed store," Hank said. "His cousin works for the surveying company. They've been out here twice in the past year. Nobody noticed because they came as hunters." Elias said slowly, "Which direction does the line run?" Hank looked at him. "Through the valley, north to south. Right along the eastern edge of this property." More silence. Margaret, from the kitchen doorway, said, "The eastern parcel. The one Vivian owns." Every head turned. "Her land sits between this ranch and the valley floor," Margaret said. "If the rail line comes through the valley and this ranch is sold to a land trust, Vivian's parcel becomes the connection point. She'd control access to the line from this entire section of the county." She paused. "That's not just valuable. That's worth enough to fund everything she'd ever want to do in this territory." The table absorbed this. Pete Calloway said, "She's been planning this for years." "At least 6, Margaret said. "That's when she bought the parcel." Caleb was looking at the table. He had the specific stillness of a man who was revising a long history in light of new information, recalculating every interaction, every visit, every pleasant conversation with a woman he had believed was simply a neighbor. Margaret watched his face go through it and felt something ache in her chest, not for herself, but for him. For the particular betrayal of discovering that someone had been calculating around you for years while you were simply trying to survive. "She came to me 6 years ago," he said quietly. "When Clara," he stopped. "After Clara died, she came to offer condolences, and she asked me then whether I had ever considered the eastern boundary of my property." Nobody spoke. I thought she was being neighborly, he said. She was being strategic, Margaret said. Her voice was gentle. There's a difference, and it took time to see it because you were grieving, and she knew it, and she used it. Caleb looked up at her. That's not a reflection of your judgment, she said. That's a reflection of her character. He held her eyes for a moment. Something settled in his face, not peace, not yet, but the beginning of the process of putting something down that had been carried wrong. What do we do? Thomas said. Caleb looked around the table. At the 12 men who had been running this ranch alongside him for years. At the young hand who had started leaving food for himself in the night and now sat at a table where there was always enough. At Elias Carter, 22 years of loyalty sitting in the set of his jaw. At Hank, who talked too much and felt everything deeply and was constitutionally incapable of letting a wrong go unnamed. At Margaret in the kitchen doorway. We go to Judge Webb, Caleb said. The meeting with Judge Harlan Webb happened on a Friday morning, in his office at the county courthouse. And Margaret went with Caleb, because Caleb had asked her to, and also because she had the county records and the property documents she had gathered over the past month organized into a folder that she had been keeping in the bottom of her flour tin. Caleb had found the folder 2 days earlier, when he was looking for the measuring cup. He had looked at it, looked at her, said nothing. She had said, I told you I was curious. He had put the measuring cup back and closed the tin. Judge Webb listened to everything. He was a man who had spent 30 years on the bench in this county and had the specific quality of a person who heard things completely before responding to them. He let Caleb speak. He let Margaret present the records. He looked at everything she put in front of him with the careful attention of a man who understood that paper was the most honest thing in a room, because it didn't have feelings about its own content. When they were finished, he sat back and was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Mrs. Whitmore, how did you come to have all of this? I went to the county office, she said. Multiple times, it looks like. 3 times, she said. The records are public. I just asked to see them. He looked at the folder. You organized this yourself? Yes, sir. He looked at her the way he had looked at her at the gathering, the full appraising look of a man recalibrating. The land trust's offer to Caleb, he said, and their suggestion about water rights. That would constitute coercive business practice at minimum. Depending on their relationship with the Caldwell woman and what can be proven about prior arrangement, he paused. That could be considerably more serious. What would you need to prove it? Caleb said. Communication between Vivian Caldwell and the trust, Webb said. Letters, records. Something that shows the offer wasn't independent. He looked at Margaret. Do you have anything like that? Margaret opened the folder to the last section. She pulled out 3 pieces of paper. Webb leaned forward. The trust filed a business registration with the county 3 years ago, Margaret said. Standard document, but the registered agent, she pointed, is a law firm in Helena, Garrison and Burke. She pulled the second sheet. Garrison and Burke also represented Vivian Caldwell in the purchase of the eastern parcel 6 years ago. She pulled the third. And last year, Vivian Caldwell made a deposit at the Helena Bank of a sum consistent with an investor buy-in to a land acquisition fund. The bank records are public when filed as business income, which this was. The office was very quiet. Judge Webb looked at the 3 papers. He looked at Margaret, he said. Mrs. Whitmore, what did you do before you came to Broken Willow? I kept my family's accounts, she said. And I read everything I could find because books were cheaper than other kinds of education. He nodded slowly. I'm going to need to keep these. I made copies, she said. She produced a second set from the folder. You can keep the originals. Caleb was looking at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Not admiration exactly. Something past admiration. Something that had no clean name but was entirely visible to anyone paying attention. Webb looked at the copies. You made copies. Before I left the house this morning, she said. In case you needed them. Webb looked at Caleb. Son, he said, do you understand what you have here? Caleb looked at Margaret. I'm beginning to, he said. The news that Judge Webb had opened a formal inquiry into the Northern Territories Land Trust and its business practices in the county reached Vivian Caldwell by Saturday evening. Margaret knew this because Sunday morning, Viv's buggy came up the road to Broken Willow at a speed that was entirely inconsistent with a social call. Caleb was in the yard, Margaret was on the porch. The crew and this was either coincidence or the specific instinct of 12 men who had learned to pay attention happened to be visible in various parts of the property, not gathered, not obviously waiting, but present. All of them. Vivian got out of the buggy and she was not, for the first time in Margaret's experience, composed. Her color was high, her hat was slightly wrong. Her eyes were doing the thing eyes did when a person had spent a night not sleeping, and a morning not eating, and had arrived somewhere with too much feeling and not enough plan. She looked at Caleb. Then she looked at Margaret. You did this, she said. Not to Caleb, to Margaret. Margaret said nothing. You went to Webb, Vivian said. She stopped. Something crossed her face, fury. Yes, but underneath it something more complicated. You have been here 4 months. 11 weeks, Margaret said quietly. 11 weeks, Vivian repeated. You have been here 11 weeks, and you have. She'd a gesture that took in the yard, the house, the crew, everything that said, without words, you have taken all of this from me. Margaret looked at her, not unkindly, with the clear eyes of a woman who had spent a very long time being underestimated by people who had more surface and less substance. Miss Caldwell, she said, I didn't take anything from you. I protected what was already someone else's, she paused. If you spent 6 years building a plan around the idea that Caleb would eventually be alone and desperate enough to sell, that's not something I took from you. That was never yours to begin with, Vivian's jaw tightened. You don't know what this land means to me. I know what it means to him, Margaret said. And to the men who've worked it. And to me, she held Vivian's gaze. That's enough. Vivian turned to Caleb. Caleb, you can't seriously be letting her speak for you. She's not speaking for me, Caleb said. His voice was the quiet that was not soft. She's speaking for herself, and everything she said is correct. He looked at Vivian directly, and Margaret could see in his face the completion of a recursion that had been happening all week, the full understanding of what had been around him for 6 years. Looking like friendship, operating as something else entirely. Vivian, don't come back here. Vivian looked at him. Something in her expression shifted. The anger fell away for just a moment, and what was underneath it was something older and more genuine, the actual feeling that had been under all the strategy. Caleb, he said, not cruelly, but completely. Vivian stood in the yard for a long moment. Then she looked at Margaret one more time, and this look was different from all the others. This one had no calculation in it, just the raw, unguarded look of a woman who had just lost something she had never actually had, but had spent years believing was possible. Margaret held that look without flinching, because she understood it. Not the methods, not the cruelty, but the fear underneath it, the fear of being overlooked, of being left without a place, of watching something you wanted move permanently out of reach. She understood that fear in the marrow of her bones. It did not excuse what Vivian had done, but it made Margaret feel something other than satisfaction when the buggy left. You all right? Caleb said beside her. Yes, she said. You don't look it, she exhaled. I feel sorry for her, she said. I know I probably shouldn't. He was quiet for a moment. You feel sorry for her, he repeated. Not for what she did, Margaret said. For what she thought she had to do it for. He looked at her for a long time. Margaret. He stopped. Tried again. You are not what I expected. You've said that before, she said. I know, he said. I keep needing to say it. The formal inquiry took 3 weeks. During those 3 weeks, Margaret kept cooking, kept feeding 12 men, kept making bread at 4:30 in the morning, and kept the kitchen light on later than it needed to be. She wrote letters for Caleb when the legal correspondence required language more precise than he was comfortable producing. She sat with him at the work table on 3 separate evenings while he went through documents that the inquiry required, and on the third evening, somewhere around 9 o'clock, she fell asleep sitting upright at the table with her cheek on her folded arms, and Caleb sat across from her for a full 15 minutes finishing what he was working on before he said her name softly and she startled awake. She looked at him, at the papers, at the lamp burning low. "How long was I asleep?" she said. "Long enough," he said. She straightened up, smoothed her hair. "I have to make the bread starter before." "It's done," he said. She stopped. "You made the bread starter?" "You showed me how last week," he said. "I watched." She stared at him. "It's on the shelf," he said. "Go to bed." She stood up. Then she stopped. She turned around. "Caleb," she said. He looked up from the papers. "When this is over," she said. "When the inquiry is done and the lawyers are gone and everything goes back to whatever the normal version of this is going to be." She paused. "I want to talk about what this is." He held her eyes. "What we are," she said. "Not around it." He was quiet for a moment. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. She went to bed. He stayed at the table for another hour, but he didn't read a single word of the documents in front of him. The twist that broke everything open arrived not from the lawyers or the judge or the land trust. It arrived in a letter from Ohio. Margaret found it on a Tuesday in the weekly mail that Thomas brought from town. Her name written on the front in handwriting she had not seen in 2 years but recognized immediately in the specific way you recognize the handwriting of someone who had known you before you knew yourself. Her aunt, her mother's older sister Ruth, who had not written to her in 2 years, who had not spoken at her mother's funeral, who had been the person standing at the back of the church with the expression of a woman who had opinions about the deceased and was restraining them out of social obligation. She took the letter to the kitchen and opened it. She read it once. Then she set it down and stood at the stove for a moment, not doing anything. Then she read it again. The letter was 3 pages, written in the dense, economical hand of a woman who had a great deal to say and had been holding it for 2 years. And the substance of it was this. Ruth had heard, through the network of correspondence that connected small-town Ohio to small-town Montana more efficiently than most people realized, that Margaret had married a rancher in Montana Territory. And Ruth wanted Margaret to know, felt she had an obligation to inform her. She said, which was the language people used when they wanted to do damage and call it duty, that Margaret's late mother had borrowed a significant sum of money from Ruth 12 years ago. That the debt had never been repaid, that it had been accruing what Ruth called a family interest for 12 years. And that Ruth felt, given Margaret's current apparent stability, that it was time to discuss repayment. The amount Ruth named was 3 times what Margaret's mother had ever made in a year. Margaret stood at the stove with the letter in her hand and thought about her mother. About the years her mother had worked to keep them fed and housed and together, and about all the things her mother had never told her, and about the particular courage of a woman who carries a debt in silence rather than let her child feel the weight of it. She folded the letter. She put it in her apron pocket. She made lunch. She got through the whole day without saying anything to anyone, which was a different kind of accomplishment from the ones this ranch had previously known her for. It was Caleb who noticed at supper the way he always noticed, quietly and without making a production of it. He came into the kitchen after the men cleared out and said, "Something happened today." "I'm fine," she said. "I didn't ask if you were fine," he said. She kept washing the dishes, Margaret. She stopped washing. She turned around. She reached into her apron pocket and held out the letter. He took it. Read it. His expression as he read it went through several things she watched in sequence: confusion, then understanding, then something that set into his jaw like stone. He looked up. "This woman is your family?" "My mother's sister," Margaret said. "We were never close. She's claiming your mother owed her money." She is. Do you believe her? Margaret was quiet for a moment. I believe my mother may have borrowed something, she said. I don't believe it was this amount, and I don't believe there was any interest agreed upon, because my mother would have told me. She told me everything that mattered before she died. She looked at the letter in his hands. What I believe is that Ruth heard I had a stable situation and decided to test how stable it was. Caleb looked at the letter. She names a repayment amount here. I know, Margaret, this is he stopped. You don't have this kind of money. I know that too, she said, and she's expecting. Caleb, she looked at him. I didn't tell you because I had a plan. I told you because you asked, and I don't want there to be things I haven't told you. She held his eyes. You said something like that to me once. I think it was worth saying back. He stood in the kitchen with the letter in his hands and looked at her, truly looked, the way he had been looking at her for weeks now, with all of it visible, nothing stored away, nothing managed down to a safe temperature. You are not going to pay this woman, he said. Caleb. You are not paying it alone, he said. Whatever your mother owed, whatever is legitimately owed, we figure that out. Together. And whatever isn't legitimate, his voice was the quiet that was not soft again. She's going to need to explain herself to a lawyer. Margaret stared at him. Yes, he said. We. She stood in the kitchen looking at this man who had sent for someone practical and gotten something he couldn't categorize, who had held her hand across a work table and made bread starter so she could sleep, who had said the word we like. It was the simplest and most obvious word in the language. You know, she said, when I came here, I thought the hardest thing was going to be the work. It's not the work, he said. No, she said. It's learning to let someone help. He crossed the kitchen. He stopped directly in front of her. He was close enough that she could see every line on his face, every year of it, all the sorrow and the stubbornness and the specific tenderness that spent years convincing himself he couldn't afford. You helped 12 men figure out who they were, he said, low and direct. You can let one man help you figure out what you're owed. She held his eyes. Then she said, very quietly, I think I'm starting to know what I'm owed. He nodded once. He didn't step back. She didn't either. And outside in the yard, Hank Dooley walked past the kitchen window, looked in without meaning to, and walked directly back to the bunkhouse where he sat on his bunk and told Thomas Reed, who hadn't been anywhere near the window, it's happening. Thomas said, what's happening? Everything, Hank said. And he was right. The lawyer Caleb hired was named Samuel Briggs. And he arrived from Helena on a Wednesday morning with a leather briefcase and the specific energy of a man who had spent 20 years turning complicated situations into simple ones and charged accordingly. He sat at the kitchen table because every important conversation at Broken Willow happened at the kitchen table now, which was something that had shifted without anyone deciding it, and he read Ruth's letter twice, looked at the records Margaret had organized, and said, How long did you say you've been here? 3 months, Margaret said. He looked at the folder of documents. You gathered all of this in 3 months. I had time in the morning, she said. He looked at Caleb. Caleb said nothing, with the particular expression of a man who had stopped being surprised by his wife and had moved into a state of ongoing impressed resignation. Briggs looked back at the letter. Your aunt claims 12 years of accumulated interest on an amount she says your mother borrowed. Do you have any documentation of the original loan? No, Margaret said, but I have my mother's account books from the past 15 years. She produced them from the folder, 3 small ledgers, worn at the corners, filled with her mother's careful handwriting. If Ruth lent her a significant sum, it would appear in these. My mother recorded every debt. Briggs opened the first ledger. He went quiet for a moment. Then he looked up. There's an entry here. 12 years ago. From Ruth he read the amount. It was less than a quarter of what Ruth was claiming. Margaret said nothing. She had already seen it. She had found it the night Caleb handed her back the letter, had gone to the cedar chest where she kept her mother's things, and found the ledgers in the bottom, and sat on the floor of her room, reading them by lamplight, until nearly midnight. She had found the entry. She had found the repayment entries too, 3 of them, spread across 4 years, each noted in her mother's hand with the date and the amount and, in the margin beside the last one, 2 words that had made Margaret sit on the floor for a long time before she got up. Almost free. Her mother had been almost free of the debt. And Ruth, apparently, had decided that almost wasn't good enough. The repayment entries, Briggs said, turning pages. 3 of them, Margaret said. The remaining balance, if you subtract what was repaid, is approximately a fraction of what she's claiming. Briggs finished. He closed the ledger. Mrs. Whitmore, your aunt has either made a significant accounting error, or she is attempting to collect a debt that was largely settled. He paused. In my experience, women like your aunt rarely make accounting errors. No, Margaret said. They don't. Caleb, who had been sitting quietly through all of this, said, "What do we do?" "We write a response," Briggs said, itemized, with copies of the relevant ledger entries. "We acknowledge the remaining balance," he said the number. "And we indicate that we are prepared to settle that amount in full and that any claim beyond it will be contested in court with documentary evidence." He looked at Margaret. "That should end it, will it?" Margaret said. Briggs considered her. "Women who send letters like this one are usually testing the situation," he said. "They want to know if the person on the other end is too frightened or too isolated to push back. When they discover they're not," he closed the briefcase. "Usually they find a different direction to look." Margaret nodded. "I'll draft the response tonight," Briggs said. "You'll have it by morning." He left. And the kitchen was quiet except for the stove and the Montana wind doing what it always did. And Caleb reached across the table and put his hand over Margaret's exactly as he had done the night they held on across the work table. "She recorded everything," Margaret said. Her voice was steady but thin at the edges. "She knew she had to be able to prove it someday. She was protecting me even then." She looked at her mother's ledger, still open on the table. "She was always protecting me. I just didn't know what from." Caleb said nothing. He didn't move his hand. She turned her palm up and held on. "She would have liked this place," Margaret said after a moment. "Tell me about her," Caleb said. She looked at him. "Now, we've got time," he said, so she told him. About her mother's kitchen in Ohio, which had smelled like wood smoke and dried herbs and the particular sweetness of apples in autumn. About a woman who had stretched 3 ingredients into 5 different meals and made every one of them feel like abundance. About the way she had laughed low and real, not performed, the laugh of a person who found genuine things genuinely funny. About the garden she kept, the seeds she saved, the specific pride she took in feeding people well, which Margaret had absorbed without knowing it was being transmitted. Caleb listened. He asked questions, not the polite surface questions of someone waiting for their turn to speak, but the real ones, the ones that required her to reach further back and bring out details she hadn't thought about in years. By the time she finished, the lamp was burning lower and both cups of coffee had gone cold, and she felt something in her chest that was not exactly grief and not exactly peace but lived somewhere between them. In the specific territory of a loss that had been carried alone for too long, and had just been for the first time shared. "She sounds like someone who deserved better than what she got," Caleb said. "She does," Margaret said, "but she would have said she got exactly what she needed." That was how she looked at things. She paused. "I'm trying to learn to look at things that way." "Are you managing it?" he said. She looked at him across the table. At the lamp between them. At this man who had settled for practicality and gotten something that kept him up past midnight asking about her mother. "Yes," she said, "I think I am." Ruth's response to Briggs's letter arrived in 11 days, which was fast enough to confirm that she had been waiting to see what came back. The response was brief. She acknowledged the ledger entries. She accepted the remaining balance. She did not apologize. Margaret read the letter, put it in the stove, and went back to making bread. Thomas, who was at the kitchen table drinking coffee when the letter arrived and witnessed the entire sequence, said, "That's it?" That's it, Margaret said. He watched the letter burn. 11 weeks of worry, and it's not worry that ends things, she said. It's paperwork. She turned back to the bread, remember that. He thought about it. That's either very wise or very depressing, he said. Most wisdom is, she said. He laughed. She didn't, but her mouth did something that was adjacent to a smile, and Thomas Reed, who had come a long way from the boy eating bread in the dark in the yard, recognized it for exactly what it was. The inquiry into the Northern Territories Land Trust concluded in the third week of November, and the conclusion was not quiet. Judge Webb's findings established that the Land Trust had engaged in coordinated acquisition practices that violated several county statutes regarding disclosure and fair dealing. 3 properties were involved. Broken Willow was one. The other 2 were smaller ranches whose owners had, under the pressure of the same veiled water rights threats, already signed preliminary agreements. The preliminary agreements were voided. The Land Trust withdrew from the county. And Vivian Caldwell's connection to the trust, established through the Garrison and Burke documents Margaret had provided, became a matter of public county record, which meant it became a matter of public knowledge, which in a county of this size meant that by the following Sunday every person within 30 miles knew exactly what had happened and exactly who had been behind it. Margaret heard about the findings from Caleb, who heard them from Judge Webb directly. He came in from town on a Thursday afternoon and sat at the kitchen table and told her everything, and when he was done he said, "Webb wants to know if you'd be willing to speak at the county meeting next month." "About what you found, how you found it." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "Why me?" "Because you're the one who found it," he said. And because he paused. Because Webb thinks people in this county need to understand that what happened here can happen to anyone. And that it can be stopped by anyone, not just lawyers or judges. He held her eyes. By someone who pays attention and isn't afraid to use what she sees. She looked at him. "You told him to ask me." "I suggested he might want to," Caleb said. "It's his idea." She considered it. "I've never spoken at a public meeting." "I know," he said. "People are going to look at me and think." "Let them think," Caleb said. "They thought wrong before." "It didn't stop you." He leaned forward slightly. "Margaret, you walked into a room that had already decided about you and changed its mind. You can do it in a courthouse." She held his gaze for a long moment. "All right," she said. He exhaled. "Good. You'll be there," she said. "I'll be in the front row," he said, and he was. The county meeting was the second week of December, and the room was full, in the way rooms got full when people sensed that something important was happening and didn't want to miss it. Margaret stood at the front of that room in her best dress, the dark blue one she had not worn since she arrived, which fit her exactly as she was and which she had decided, that morning in front of the mirror, was enough, and she spoke for 20 minutes about property records and disclosure requirements, and the specific mechanisms by which powerful interests acquired land from people who didn't know they needed to be watching. She was not a practiced speaker, she knew that. Her voice was not dramatic. She didn't have rhetorical flourishes or the practiced confidence of someone who had done this before. What she had was clarity and specificity, and the particular authority of a person who had done the work and was reporting what she found. The room was very quiet while she talked. At the end, Judge Webb stood and said, "Mrs. Whitmore, on behalf of this county, I want to express our debt to you. 3 families kept their land this season because of what you found." "That is not a small thing," the room responded. "Not all at once. It started somewhere in the middle and moved outward, the way real things moved, without a conductor, without a cue, just the organic response of people recognizing something true." Margaret stood at the front of that room and received it with the stillness of a woman who had not expected it and did not entirely know what to do with it. In the front row, Caleb Whitmore was not clapping. He was just watching her, with the look he'd had at the county gathering when he said she had done that all of it and told her not to sell it short. Except this time the look was fuller, more committed. The look of a man who has stopped being careful about what he feels because he has run out of reasons to be. From 2 rows back, Hank Dooley was clapping with his whole body and had the expression of a man at a revival. Beside him, Thomas Reed's face had the specific openness of the very young encountering something they will remember their whole lives. Pete Calloway had his hat in his hands and was looking at it with the particular dignity of a man who feels things deeply and has no intention of letting anyone know. Elias Carter, at the end of the row, was not clapping. He was nodding, slowly, repeatedly, the nod of a man who had been watching something develop for 3 months and was now watching it arrive. Margaret found each of their faces in that room. She let herself feel it. All of it. The conversation she had told Caleb she wanted to have, the real one, the proper one, the one about what they were happened not in the kitchen and not at the work table, but on the porch, on a December night that was cold enough to see your breath and clear enough to see further into the Montana sky than seemed reasonable. They had been sitting out there for 20 minutes saying nothing in particular when Caleb said, "You've been here 4 months." 16 weeks, she said. "You're counting." "I count things," she said. "You know that." He was quiet for a moment. "When you came here," he said, "I told you this was a practical arrangement. That I needed someone who could manage the household." "I remember," she said. "I was wrong about what I needed," he said. "Not about needing help, but about what kind." He looked at the sky. "I needed someone who could see what I couldn't, who could look up when I had my head down. Who could," he stopped, "who could make 12 men feel like they had a home instead of a job? Who could walk into a county meeting and change what people understood about themselves?" He paused. "I needed you specifically. I just didn't know enough to ask for you specifically." The cold air moved between them. "Caleb," she said. "Are you saying what I think you're saying?" "I'm saying I love you," he said. "Not because the arrangement requires it. Not because you're useful. Because you are." He turned and looked at her directly, with all of it visible, nothing managed down, nothing stored away. "You are the best thing that has ever happened to this land. And I would like, if you're willing, to stop calling this an arrangement." She looked at him for a long moment. "What would you call it instead?" she said. "A marriage," he said, "a real one." The porch was very quiet. "You made the bread starter so I could sleep," she said. "Yes, you sat with me while I talked about my mother for 2 hours. Yes. You put my folder of county records in your coat pocket before we went to see Judge Webb because you were afraid I'd forget it." "You wouldn't have forgotten it," he said. "I know," she said. "But you didn't know that yet." She held his eyes. "That's what I'm saying." He looked at her. "Margaret," he said. "Will you?" "Yes," she said. He blinked. "I haven't finished asking." "You don't need to," she said. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You are the most efficient woman I have ever met." "I know," she said. He reached over and took her hand. She let him. They sat on the porch in the December's cold with their hands locked together and the Montana sky doing its impossible things above them, and neither of them said anything else for a long while. Because everything that needed saying had been said and everything that needed doing had been done, and what was left was simply this, the specific warmth of 2 people who had found each other by accident and stayed on purpose. The twist that arrived the following morning was not a crisis. It was, for once, something else entirely. It was Thomas Reed, at the kitchen table at 5:30 in the morning, with a letter in his hand and an expression Margaret had not seen on his face before, not fear. Not the careful wariness she had come to know as his resting state, but something open and uncertain and bright. "I got a letter," he said when she came in. "I can see that," she said. She started the coffee. "Good news or bad, I don't know yet," he said. He held it out. She took it. "Read it." It was from an agricultural college in the East, not a rejection, but an invitation to apply, based on a letter of recommendation that had apparently been written on his behalf. She looked up. "Did you apply to this school?" "No," he said. "Then someone wrote to them about you," she said. "Someone who knew your work." She set the letter down. "Thomas, Who have you been talking to about cattle management? He stared at her. Judge Webb asked me about it. At the gathering. He asked how we rotated the pastures and I told him, and he seemed interested. I didn't think. He stopped. He wrote to the college? Someone did, she said. Thomas looked at the letter. He looked at it the way he had looked at the bread on the first morning she had set it beside him in the yard, like something he wanted very badly and did not entirely trust himself to reach for. I can't afford, he started. Read the whole letter, she said. He read it. His face went through several things. The letter included information about a scholarship fund available to working ranch hands from Western territories. It included an application fee waiver. It included the name of the program contact and an encouraging note from someone who signed themselves H. Webb County Judge. Thomas set the letter down on the table. He did not say anything for a moment. You're going to cry, Margaret said, turning back to the coffee. That's fine. Nobody's watching. I'm not. His voice broke slightly. I'm not crying. Of course not, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, do you think I should go? She turned around. Looked at him, this young man who had sat in the dark before sunrise eating cornbread because he didn't trust there would be enough, who had learned to look up and meet someone's eyes and give a nod that meant something. I think, she said, that you came here because you needed somewhere safe to figure out what you were worth. And I think you know now. And I think knowing it here and going out into the world and using it are two different things. He held her eyes. What if I leave in it? He stopped. What if it's not like this somewhere else? It won't be exactly like this somewhere else, she said. But you'll know how to build it, because you learned how here. She held his gaze. Thomas, go. He looked at the letter. He looked at her. He picked it up. Will you help me write the application, he said. Saturday morning, she said. Bring everything. He folded the letter with careful hands and put it in his shirt pocket, close to his chest, the way you carried something you didn't want to risk losing. When Caleb came in for breakfast an hour later and Margaret told him, he went to the door of the bunkhouse and said, Thomas. Thomas appeared. Webb write you a letter? Caleb said. Yes, sir. You going to apply? Yes, sir. Caleb nodded. Good. He turned back to the house. Thomas said, you knew. Caleb stopped. Webb asked me if I had a man who showed aptitude, he said, without turning around. I said I had the best one I'd ever seen with cattle rotation. He paused. I told him your name. Thomas stood in the doorway of the bunkhouse and could not speak for a moment. Thank you, he managed finally. Caleb. Caleb glanced back. Nodded once. Went inside. Margaret, who had heard all of it from the kitchen, kept her face to the stove, so neither of them would see her expression. But she was smiling. December became January. The ranch settled into winter with the specific peace of a place that had survived something and come out knowing itself better. The kitchen was always warm. The table was always full. The bread was always made before sunrise and the coffee was always ready. And the 12 men who had once looked at a woman stepping off a stagecoach and wondered how she could possibly survive had stopped wondering that so long ago they had almost forgotten they'd ever asked. Almost. Hank still remembered. He thought about it sometimes in the way you thought about the things you'd been wrong about when you were too proud to say so at the time. He thought about the first day and the way he'd looked at Margaret and made his calculations in the space of 30 seconds and been wrong about all of them. He brought it up one evening in February, when it was just him and Margaret in the kitchen after supper. Which happened sometimes now. The crew had taken to lingering after meals in the way of people who had nowhere better to be and no desire to pretend otherwise. You know what I said, Hank said that first day. I have an idea, Margaret said. You heard it. The barn has thin walls, she said. He was quiet for a moment. I was wrong, he said. Not elaborating, not explaining, just the bare fact offered plainly, in the way Hank offered the things he actually meant. Margaret looked at him. I know, she said. I'm sorry, he said. I know that, too, she said. He nodded, drank his coffee. You know what changed my mind, he said. The stew, she said. He pointed. The stew, he confirmed. She shook her head slowly, but the smile was fully visible this time. Hank, you are the most honest man I have ever met. My wife used to say that was a flaw, he said. Your wife was wrong, Margaret said. In this particular case. He grinned a full, genuine grin that transformed his face entirely, and she understood in that moment why the crew liked him in spite of everything, or maybe because of everything. You know, he said, I told Pete, first week you were here, that you'd be gone inside a month. I remember you thinking that, she said. Pete told me last week that he owes me $3 for being wrong. He paused. I told him to keep it. She looked at him. Felt wrong to profit from being stupid, he said. She laughed. Not the careful almost smile, not the adjacent to smile an actual laugh, real and low and unguarded. And Hank Dooley looked like a man who had just received something he hadn't known he wanted. Caleb appeared in the kitchen doorway in time to hear it. He looked at Margaret, at Hank, at the kitchen that smelled like wood smoke and the good remnants of supper and years of careful use and slow belonging. He said nothing. He didn't need to. On a Tuesday evening in late February, Caleb came into the kitchen with something in his hand. Margaret looked up from the work table. He set it down in front of her. It was a deed. She looked at it. Looked at him. What is this? The property deed, he said. I had Briggs draft an amendment. He sat down across from her. Your name is on it, mine. She went very still. Caleb, this is your home, he said. Not by arrangement. Not by courtesy, by right. He held her eyes. Your name belongs on the deed of your own home. She looked down at the paper, at her name, written in legal ink beside his on the document that said this land was theirs. At the signature line where she would need to sign to make it true. Her hand was shaking when she picked up the pen. She signed it. Caleb took the pen back, and their fingers held for a moment before she let go, and he said, very quietly, Welcome home, Margaret. She could not speak for a moment. Then she said, You made the bread starter again this morning. It needed doing, he said. You always say that. It's always true, he said. She looked at him across the work table. At this man complicated and steady and slow to speak and careful with everything, except she had come to understand the things he had decided to be reckless about. At the specific way he held himself when he was near her now, which was different from any other time she had seen him looser, more present. Like a man who had finally found the thing he had been braced against losing, and could now allow himself to stop bracing. I love you, she said, not for the first time, but it was still new enough that saying it felt like a small act of courage every time. I know, he said, then I love you. He paused, in case that needed saying again. It always needs saying, she said. He reached across the work table. She took his hand. The deed sat between them on the table with both their names on it, and the kitchen was warm, and outside the Montana winter was doing what Montana winters did, vast and indifferent and beautiful, and inside Broken Willow Ranch. A woman who had arrived with one suitcase and a closed door in her heart was sitting at her own table in her own home, holding the hand of a man who had learned, because of her, what it meant to be in a place that wasn't just running but living. And in the bunkhouse across the yard, 12 men who had once wondered if she would survive this place were sleeping soundly in the specific way of people who know, without having to think about it, that someone is looking after them. Thomas Reed's college application had gone out 3 weeks ago. He would get the acceptance letter in April, and he would stand in the kitchen and cry in front of everyone and pretend he wasn't, and Margaret would hand him coffee and tell him to drink it. And Hank would shake his hand with both of his and not say a word, which would be the most eloquent thing Hank had ever managed. But that was April. Tonight was February, and the deed was signed, and the bread starter was on the shelf, and the woman who had walked into a yard full of doubt and cooked until it became certainty was exactly where she had always been heading without knowing it. Without planning it, through nothing more and nothing less than the willingness to keep showing up and feed people well and refuse, absolutely refuse to be anything other than exactly who she was. The quiet bride nobody expected, the woman nobody saw coming. The heart of Broken Willow Ranch. Her name was on the deed now. And she was never, not for a single day, leaving again.